You're listening to Recovery, Healing, Outreach, and Awareness, a podcast about domestic violence, sponsored by Randy's House of Angels. Domestic or intimate partner violence is a complex and silent epidemic that affects millions of people worldwide. To respond to the overwhelming issues associated with domestic violence, Randy's House of Angels has produced a series of podcasts that will bring this epidemic to the forefront of public consciousness and break the silence that often shrouds it. This is Paul Miller, producer of this program, and by creating a dedicated platform, Randy's House of Angels hopes to create a safe space for survivors, advocates, and experts to share their stories, insights, and knowledge. A series of topics will be discussed that can offer vital support and resources to victims and survivors, helping them realize that they are not alone and that there is help available. It can also serve as a catalyst for raising awareness and fostering necessary conversations within families, communities, and institutions to empower individuals, foster empathy, and inspire collective action toward eradicating domestic violence while creating a safer, more compassionate society. We invite you to access the podcast by going to randyshouseofangels.org. Today we are discussing how domestic violence is portrayed in movies, television shows, and music, and its impact on public perceptions and the normalization of abusive behaviors in relationships through common media tropes. The role of celebrities and influencers in shaping awareness or perpetuating misconceptions about domestic violence is discussed. We will look at examples of media that have positively or negatively influenced conversations around abuse. We will examine the power of pop culture and media in raising awareness and reducing the stigma around domestic violence. Recent films, shows, and public figures have used their platforms to highlight the issue and support survivors. Joining us today is Dr. Misty L. Knight. Dr. Knight is a professor of communication studies and director of women's and gender studies at Shippensburg University. She earned a Master of Arts in Communication from West Texas A&M University and a PhD from the University of Southern Mississippi. As an instructor, she teaches courses such as popular culture and gender construction, public speaking, rhetorical criticism, political rhetoric, and seminars in women's and gender studies. Her primary research interests involve activism, political rhetoric, self-defense rhetoric, and humor in communication. Today's podcast facilitator is Sherry Peters. Sherry Peters, a master's level social worker, is a nationally recognized facilitator in the children's mental health field and currently serves on the board of Randy's House of Angels. Formerly the director of the Psychiatric Residential Treatment Facility Waiver Initiative at Georgetown University's National Technical Assistance Center for Children's Mental Health, Ms. Peters also spent 21 years in leadership positions in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, addressing children's mental health policy and program development. This includes suicide prevention and trauma-related issues. In her early career, she spent a decade as a therapist in residential and community settings.
Welcome, Dr. Knight. It's so nice to have you here. I'm looking so forward to learning more about how domestic violence is portrayed in the media, movies, TV, whatever. I wonder if you would be willing to give us sort of the perspective.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to work with Randy's House of Angels and talk about some of these things. When we look at various mediums, whether it's music or television or film or even sports and advertising and, so many different areas, there has been a sort of an interesting history and relationship of how domestic violence or intimate partner violence has been represented, how it's been discussed. And so, as, historically we sort of looked at domestic violence as just the physical elements and didn't really think about emotional abuse or financial abuse or any of the psychological types of things. And so sometimes when we look back at movies, at music, we start to see it in a different light. So I think, everybody kind of looks at the honeymooners as sort of that classic example of, the threats of physical violence. Although we knew he would never hit her, this sort of thing, there's still that emotional impact of the constant threat. Then we look at shows, that I loved to watch when I was young, Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie. And I think those are really interesting because in both of those situations, we had a male figure who was insistent that the woman who was the lead character was, not allowed to use her powers. Mm-hmm. He was always discouraged from anything that might make her life easier. And so, we can see that how this relates in relationships where we can't just twitch our nose and make things happen. But so why don't you have this? Why can't you do it this way? And those sorts of attitudes of you need to work harder. You're not doing this the right way. You're not doing it the way I want you to do it. And so it kind of gives us a different perspective on those classic shows that we thought, oh, how innocent and cute and fun and then we just keep moving forward. I think one of the classic examples for those who are maybe Gen X and older, the made-for-TV movie that came out in '84, The Burning Bed, with Farrah Fawcett, that was about a real live case in Michigan where a woman who had suffered at the hands of her husband for 13 plus years finally kind of snapped and murdered him. And she was, that particular case was one of the first where the term battered woman syndrome was used as a defense. And so then that became sort of the association with this idea of domestic violence, that's sort of, the comeuppance or what have you, which also is an unhealthy way of looking at it. So it's not just, it's the response as well as the original attack.
So you're talking about moving from a subtle portrayal way back that many of us may not have even thought so much about into the more visible kind of physical violence that, again, is not portrayed in a healthy way in the media. So that's pretty interesting that I hadn't thought about it in that way. I Dream of Jeannie I hadn't thought about as sort of the manipulation kind of thing. Yeah. So what else about how the media portrays? You sort of stopped in the 80s. So then what? What happened next?
It's gotten a little more nuanced. We started seeing, I guess, portrayals where, while we know statistically from crime figures and reports that women tend to be targets more often than men, but that men are sometimes the targets as well. And we've started seeing that reflected. It's not just a woman's problem. It's an everyone's problem.
Yeah.
That anyone can be a target. And so there has been more of a reference to that in music and movies and TV and recognizing those things. And those are reflected in real life as well. News coverage. I can't think of her name now. She was a Disney child star, and then there's sort of a high-profile case where she and her partner got into a fight at Disneyland, and police became involved. She was arrested. He wasn't, because she was the one who had pushed him. And then more recently, a performer, a musician by the name of Sweetie, who she and her male partner, also there had been a case of where she had been accused of abusing him. And so we're starting to see more of that reflected in the media, that all sorts of people can be targets, whereas it used to be a woman's issue, at which, the terminology of battered woman syndrome.
Sure. Yeah. So how does music play into this various musicians and the lyrics and say more about the music part of media.
So I think about songs. One that has always really stuck out to me was Eminem and Rihanna. I believe he wrote the song, but they both performed the song in 2010, I believe, which was I Love the Way You Lie, which in the video has a pretty dramatic portrayal. And in the lyrics of the song, it's pretty evident of reflecting an abusive relationship, coercion, and physical abuse, and in which both partners are singing about how the relationship is toxic, but he starts to escalate, and in the video ends up setting the house on fire, making sure, he wants to make sure she's dead. And I think it was particularly impactful because just the year before, Rihanna, who was the female singer, had very publicly broken up with Chris Brown after he had assaulted her. And so not only had that made news, but the fact that she performed in this, I think it was chilling in many ways if you watched it, and especially if you knew the story. I mean, the song was incredibly powerful anyway, and it was very evident of how unhealthy this relationship was, and you sort of internally are screaming to her, get out, get out, get out of this relationship. And, it really drove home the fear. What's interesting is that was sort of, I don't want to say rebound album from Eminem. He's always had solid performances and, his sales and such. But this was almost an apology album of, recognition of some of the things he had done in his lifestyle. And it wasn't, this is cool. He was reflecting on how bad this is, and so some of the other pieces on the album were very similar in nature of a recognition of poor behavior, just in a to put that very lightly, but that he was sort of giving a nod to what shouldn't be happening.
So on balance, when you look at the media, whether it be movies, TV, music, whatever, are there more of the performers recognizing that this is not good, or is it still an ongoing thing of promoting violence? Like, how do you see the balance there?
It's sort of interesting. I had the good fortune to teach a course in pop culture and gender construction again this semester that's just wrapping up. And one of the assignments when I teach the course, I always have them create a Spotify playlist for the class. And I have them submit songs. I give them a theme and say, okay, you find a song and then explain, in a written portion about how it relates to this theme. And then, you add it to the class playlist so that by the end of the semester, we have this huge playlist of all these songs that all the students have contributed. And I find that one of the categories that they struggle with the most is when I ask them to find a song that describes a healthy relationship, and they're stumped. They really have to struggle because so many are like sort of an obsessive love or these grand gestures or this sort of thing. And so, they're able to come up with some things, and sometimes I'm questionable. I'm like, well, we need to talk if you think this is a healthy relationship. But for the most part, they're doing their best. I do think that there are those songs out there. I think about certain artists, Tim McGraw and Faith Hill, who are married artists, both in the country music genre, that have performed together and have had some really strong duets that are positive about relationships and healthy and good love songs and this sort of thing. But both, especially Tim McGraw, both have been active in domestic violence awareness and prevention. And so I I do wonder if there's a connection between the types of songs that they're performing and the idea that this is their mission. And you see that there are musicians like Rihanna, and she has been very publicly involved in domestic violence prevention campaigns and awareness, and I'm sure her background has had a lot to do with that as well. But there are a variety of other musicians. Annie Lennox, for those who, the throwback to the Eurythmics or even her solo career, she has been involved in these campaigns. Peter Gabriel is another artist who has been very vocal about violence against women and working in those campaigns to make sure that there are appropriate laws in place and awareness campaigns and those types of things. So there have been a variety of artists. I think right now Olivia Rodrigo is one of the sort of younger, newer musicians that's out there. She has a new song out, Vampire, from 2023, dealing with emotional abuse and talking about sort of an awareness. And I think some of these songs, even the ones that portray or describe elements of interpersonal violence, are informative, especially for young audiences, to hear, oh, wait, that shouldn't be happening in my relationship. I didn't realize that, or, oh, that's not a healthy thing. We're not supposed to be stalking or, doing these types of things. Then that ends up being sort of educational and helping them to sort of get agency over their own lives and their own relationships, instead of just sort of looking at popular images in media that say that it's okay.
Randy's House of Angels holds 2 major fundraising events throughout the year that support all programs, including Randy's Race, a 5K run walk for hope and courage, and a Round for Randy golf outing. All proceeds from the events support all direct services provided and allows for Randy's House of Angels to provide all programs at no cost to parents and guardians. The annual A Round for Randy golf outing, hosted by Randy's House of Angels, will take place on Friday, September 5th, 2025 at Rich Valley Golf Course. Registration begins at 7:15 with a shotgun start at 8 a.m. The annual golf outing began in 2016, and each year the golf outing has attracted more golfers and awareness of the cause. Since 2016, the golf outing has grossed over $120,000. For more information, please visit randyshouseofangels.org.
So I'm curious about your students. You've been connecting with them about these topics. What are some of their ahas? You sort of just described one with, oh, is this not a healthy relation? Is this not something that shouldn't be happening? So are there other ahas that your students come up with when you explore these pop culture issues and their connection to domestic violence?
I run a pretty open classroom. We talk about a lot of different things where we talk about theory and we talk about research and the studies that are out, but students are also encouraged and often do bring in their own lives and give examples. And sometimes it's a little more information than we had ever intended. But I do recall quite vividly a situation where a student was talking about a romantic encounter with her partner where he had witnessed some behaviors in adult material that he thought, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do during this intimate moment. And, she pushed him away and was like, why would you do that? The fact that my students seem to be more aware now. One of the things that I think is sort of interesting in a current young people versus when I was their age, I think that people have more of an awareness of their own ability to say this isn't okay. We were encouraged to be nice. And you may not like it or, but you just be nice. And they don't have to be nice. And I really enjoy that. I enjoy hearing from their stories and their perspectives. I'm like, wow, I would have never been able to say that in a dating relationship, or I never would have, I would have felt encouraged to just be nice. And it makes me so happy when I hear them sort of recognizing already things that it took me until my 40s and 50s to figure out.
Yeah, and how do you think the media plays into this? Are you seeing the media portraying it more like it's okay to say no, or it's okay to stand up for yourself? Is that the kind of thing that you think that younger folks are seeing and hearing on media?
I do. And when you think about, they've grown up with campaigns like the No More campaign that started, in 2013. There were other campaigns. There's Love is Respect that started around the same time, the early 2010s or so. And so they've sort of grown up with these types of respect yourself, respect your partner types of messages that we may not have grown up with from older generations. And so they saw that, and that was played into the shows. And so whereas we may have seen media or listened to music where it was okay that one partner shoved another or hit another, but then pulled them close and passionately kissed them, and then, the swept away in this romance, and it was never addressed. Now, when those things happen, they're addressed in the songs, in the TV shows, in the movies. And whether or not it's handled in a healthy way is not always the question, but at least it's addressed. It becomes obvious. There's public discussion about it. One of the more recent movies, It Ends With Us, there's been a lot of talk about that film and sort of how intimate partner violence is portrayed in that. And again, while it's not some sort of fairy tale ending, the students or the young people who are watching it are seeing that this isn't just something that happens. It's something that happens and then there's a consequence to that. Whereas I think in many older portrayals, it was just something that happened and then life went on.
So in the way you've been studying this for however long, would you say that our media portrayal is, I hate to say getting better, because I think there are still some things in our media that have questionable messages. However, just your thoughts, because you have studied and you kind of know where we've been and where we are right now, and maybe even where we're going.
I do. And so I think about, for example, the popularity of sports. And so when organizations like the National Football League get involved, we know there's a problem. We know there are lots of problems within any professional organization, sports organization, but the NFL has had a history of problems with players and violence on and off the field, and a number of cases, high-profile cases of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And so when they got involved with the No More campaign, and individual players started speaking out and getting really involved. For local folks, last year, Russell Wilson played for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He has been a vocal advocate for domestic violence awareness and speaking out. And so I think when organizations like that are involved, even though they do have a history of problems, and the problems haven't gone away, more and more players are speaking out. And I think when that happens, when celebrities athletes, musicians, actors, what have you, are speaking up about it, then that addresses the issue. So it's when people stay silent about it and say, well, let's not talk about it because it's uncomfortable and, we'll deal with it privately, as opposed to, hey, we're going to talk about this and look how many of us are good people, we're not doing the violence, then it isolates those individuals who previously felt like, oh, well, everybody does this and nobody's going to talk about it, so it's okay if I do it too.
So the whole idea of building awareness in the media, say more about how you see that now and the possibilities for the future. Is this awareness growing because of folks like you just talked about speaking out in the sports world, in other kinds of situations, or is there still a long way to go?
I think there's a long way to go, until the instances are down to 0%.
Right.
Then,
right.
We've got work to do. And so awareness is not the end goal, ending this is the end goal.
Right.
But awareness helps us get there. We've got to do work in addition to create awareness. But when we think about the older perspective that our society used to have, this is a private matter. This is a family issue.
You don't talk about it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's in the neighbor's house, and it's contained in their house, and we don't get involved in other people's issues. This is a private thing.
Yeah.
We're seeing that we can't do that anymore. We're seeing that it is important to speak up. It's the same perspective as bystander intervention in preventing sexual assault. That idea that if you see something, say something.
Right, right.
But just saying, hey, this behavior is not okay, to someone who might be making the jokes or saying something threatening or what have you, as well as letting the targets know, hey, I know you're going through it and you may not want to talk about it, but I'm here and I care about you and I'm paying attention. Just letting them know and not pressuring someone that they've got to do something. And that's one of the things about the awareness campaigns is saying what is and isn't okay, not saying you have to get out or you have to,
Right.
And so when you look at like social media and the hashtag why I stayed, these accounts of, there are legitimate reasons. I mean, you probably are in a relationship with someone because you do care about them, or there are things that you care about them. And so it's really tricky. It's not just an easy, hey, well, this thing happened, this precipitating event, and now I'm going to end the relationship and we will split ways forever. That's not realistic, especially when you're talking about relationships where people do care about each other for whatever reason.
Right. So when you talk to your students about these issues, do any of your students talk about the difference between their understanding of these topics and their families' understandings of these topics?
Yeah, I find that my students are so much savvier. I'm like, how did you get so smart at this age? Now, there, of course, the other areas where I'm like, oh my word. But I think in terms of being able to speak up for what they believe, for their passions, for their relationships and their own well-being, they're much more aware than generations before them. And so I think when we start seeing, it's not all about self and like I'm the most important thing, and that's not what they're doing, but they are seeing that they are important. Whereas for many of us, we were raised, in utter selflessness was the goal. You give everything, and in many cases, that's what leads us to sometimes these toxic relationships. Is you just keep giving because that's what you're supposed to do, and even if things aren't great, you committed to this relationship, so you just keep giving, and eventually they'll come around, or things will be fixed. You've just got to try harder. And people now, students now, young people now know that that's just not the case. You don't have to put up with it, that you don't have to tolerate that. And they're recognizing that in earlier stages of the relationships, so that they're not getting invested in the relationships.
So I'm curious a little bit about whether you see also some throwback to previous generations in your students, with perhaps sort of some of your students having a conflict between the messages they've heard from their families, for instance, about you just have to live with this. This is what you chose. Just, don't worry about whether you think it's right or not. Just do it. Or the messages that they are perhaps getting from some of the media that you've described.
To some degree, yes. It's just like any other generational divide or generational split, where you feel sort of sandwiched in between. Which do I do? Which do I listen to? This is the way I was raised.
Right.
But I do think that they're able to kind of reflect on. Well, I think part of it is because our society is more mobile now. We don't necessarily live in the town we grew up in. We don't necessarily live surrounded by all of our extended relatives. We move across the country, sometimes across the world for jobs. We're not as permanently fixed. And there are good things about that, and there are bad things about that.
Sure.
We don't have some of the stability and protection that we once had, but also we start to see that we have to forge our own way, and we also develop other important relationships with the people that we see as being most like us.
So we're about to wrap up, and I wonder if there's anything that I haven't asked you, or anything that you think is important for our audience to know.
I think that, a lot goes back to communication, being able to talk about what you're experiencing and witnessing, being able to have open conversations with your family members, with your kids. I think that's so important in from a parenting perspective as well as from a teaching perspective, but developing those interpersonal relationships, having your people, your crew, your individuals that you can count on, because those are the ones that are also watching out for you. If you see your friend getting into a relationship that has some red flags, they're going to be able to spot that, and they're going to be there for you. And so even, I'm not saying like you have to communicate your way out of a bad situation. But what I am saying is, even if you're going to stick in it, even if you're staying in that you've got somebody that's a little bit of a pressure release valve.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for being with us today.
Randy's House of Angels is sponsoring Season 3 of a series of podcasts that will serve as a resource to anyone impacted by domestic violence, including parents, guardians, caseworkers, health providers, advocates, teachers, trauma specialists, clinicians, and more, to provide an overview of domestic violence and how to handle situations where domestic violence is present. Season 3 will include a series of 5 podcasts that will include an overview in addressing the mental health stigma in domestic violence situations, the influence of pop culture on domestic violence, looking at the harmful tropes and changing narratives, and addressing trauma-informed juvenile probation and breaking the cycle for youth. The podcast will include testimony and stories from experts that work in the domestic violence field, criminal justice, juvenile justice, and social work academia. The podcast will be broadcasted starting in August of 2025 and run through October of 2025. Go to Randy's House of Angels website at randyshouseofangels.org. There, you can catch up on any podcast you've missed, find additional resources that support the podcasts, and we encourage you to click on the link and take our short survey. Your feedback is essential to shaping and informing future episodes of this show.